Ch.76, Closing the Capital Gates, Survival of Yong'an Bar 2. Tw, Violence.
Open the gates. Let us in.
The soldiers backed into the fortress city and pushed shut the 1,000-ton gate.
The people that had been expelled by the soldiers outside came rushing back towards it like black water tide, slapping on the doors.
On top of the towers, the soldiers roared.
Back away. Leave. Take your travel expenses and go eastward, don't stick around. However, the Yong'an refugees had turned their backs on their hometowns, fled their lands, and arrived at the one capital that was closest in distance. The gates to the royal capital closed on them, but if they wanted to survive, they would be forced to go around the fortress city and walk an even farther distance to the cities further east. The journey to the royal capital was already arduous and rough, crossing through thousands of obstacles. Many were already wounded or dead, so how could they have any more energy to continue on? Even if they were all given travel expenses, rations and water, how many more days could they hang on the road? Each of their faces were ashen, some dragging their household goods, some carried babies on their backs,
some holding stretchers.
They held each other up, some lying on the ground, unable to move any more, and others simply sat.
Fields and fields of them remained before the fortress walls. Some younger men still had the energy to be enraged, banging on the doors yelling, "You can't do this.
You're gonna kill us. We're all citizens of Xianle, you can't just kill us off like this." One of the men yelled until his voice was hoarse, "You can kick us out, it doesn't matter, I won't stay, but can you at least take my wife and my children? Please!"
Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark.
They were like ants trying to shake a tree. The fortress city gates remained unmoved. Xianle stood on top of the tower, his white robes fluttering in the wind. He crossed the parapet to watch below. Outside the royal capital, there were endless heads, black and squirming, dense and tightly knit.
Very much like swarms of ants he used to see when he played in the royal gardens in his younger years.
Back then, out of curiosity, he'd looked closer and extended a finger, wanting to poke at them secretly, but
there was immediately an attendant who cried out, "Your Highness!
Those things are dirty, you can't touch. Don't touch."
With her dress lifted, she ran over hurriedly and squished all the ants under her foot.
When those ants were alive, other than a dense swarm, there wasn't much to look at. After having been squished into something less than mud piles, there wasn't anything left to look at. Within the royal capital walls, lights filled millions of homes, and sounds of music wafted in the air. This
one fortress wall separated two completely different worlds.
Never mind that the Yong'an refugees who arrived after were kept out, even the ones that were already settled within had been expelled. Although harsh, Xianle could somewhat understand that this was because there was more and more friction between the Yong'an refugees and the royal capital residents in the recent months.
To keep such men inside the city walls, there could very well be collusion inside and out, causing havoc. However, just one thing he felt still had room for negotiation.
He spoke out loud absent-mindedly, "Why must the women and the vulnerable be expelled too? There are some who can't walk much further."
Feng Xin and Mu King were waiting on him just behind.
New King replied, if they must be expelled, then they must all be expelled. Everyone must be treated
equally. There mustn't be any favoritism, lest people be provoked. How come they could stay and not
me?
Single quote quote. You think too much, Feng Xin commented. New King said flatly, there are very well people who would think like this. Besides, if the wives and
children remain, then the men wouldn't want to go too far either.
They would return sooner or later.
Keeping people in the city is keeping future problems. Those Yong'an refugees refused to leave, so the soldiers on the towers couldn't leave either. Humph. Suit yourselves. Since the king made the command, did they think just sitting there loitering would do anything? They could loiter for 1 or 2 days, but hardly a month or 2, or a year or 2. The soldiers and residents of the royal capital all believed this. Some of the Yong'an refugees hopelessly accepted their fate, and decided to gamble traveling eastward. But such numbers were few. Most still sat stubbornly by the fortress gates, hoping the royal capital would open their doors to them, or at the very least give them somewhere to rest before journeying onwards. When new refugees arrived, although
disappointed in seeing the closed city gates, when they saw so many still keeping watch, they joined the
masses. Thus, after several days, there were more and more gathered outside the city gates. Almost 1 million people had settled and built temporary shelters, forming an impressive and curious sight. They used the
rations and water given by the king to hold on, but they were almost at their limit too.
This limit was crossed on the 5th day. Those past 5 days, Xianle had divided each day into 3, 1/3 devoted to the followers at the temple of the crown prince, 1/3 for moving water and creating rain, and 1/3 for caring for the Yong'an citizens outside the city walls. Even with Feng Xin and New King helping, sometimes Xianle felt the weight of those responsibilities. The spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak. That day, it just so happened to be a time when he wasn't guarding outside the city walls. Under the scorching sun, there was suddenly a wail outside the gates. The wailing came from a couple holding their child in their arms. Many came forward to see what's wrong with the child. Hungry or thirsty?
And soon, a shout, everyone come share some water here. This child's not looking too good.
That woman sobbed as she fed water to her red-faced child, but all the water was thrown back up.
The father said, I don't know what's going on, he's sick.
A doctor. We need a doctor. Carrying his son, he ran to the gates and started slapping the doors. Open up. Help. Someone's dying. My son's dying. Naturally, the soldiers within didn't dare to open the gates. Whether or not someone was actually dying. There were hundreds of thousands outside. If they opened up, there'd be no closing the gates. Instead, they reported to the officers higher up. The weather was hot, and the heat was making the soldiers standing watch over the past days cranky. They said apathetically, give him some water and food. Thus, they used a rope, hung some water and food, and lowered it down. Thank you, my lords and brothers, but we don't want water and food.
Can you help us find a doctor?
That man said. This made things difficult. They couldn't let him in to find a doctor, and they certainly couldn't lower a
Doctor down the city walls.
Who knows what those starving refugees would do once the doctor got outside.
Thus, those high-ranking officers replied, "Never mind. Ignore them, they can't die.
If they ask again, then
tell them the message has been sent through to request a response from the king."
The king had been deeply troubled by the Yong'an matters and easily angered the past many days, and naturally no one really dared bother him with such a small thing. The soldiers responded accordingly, and that man, feeling relieved, thanked them profusely, thanked His Majesty, and knelt to kowtow multiple
times.
Yet hours upon hours passed, shadows under the scorching sun moved from one end to the other.
But the asked-for doctor still hadn't appeared, and the temperature of that child in their arms was
growing hotter.
The arms of that couple holding their child were trembling, and that man was covered in cold sweat, mumbling, "Will anyone come? Will anyone open the gates?"
Finally, they couldn't wait any longer, and yelled to the tower's officers, "My apologies, but I want to
ask, where's the doctor?"
A soldier responded, "We're waiting for a formal response from the king." Wait for a while longer. Some citizens couldn't sit still anymore. They said that 4 hours ago, so why hasn't anyone come yet?
The soldiers heeded their superior's command and ignored him after responding.
The crowd under the fortress walls was furious, forlorn, and distressed. They surrounded the child and started wondering in doubt. Did they actually pass on the message to His Majesty?
They're not lying to us, are they?
The father of that child couldn't wait any longer. He hardened his heart, tied the child to his back, and turned to his wife to say a few last words. That woman removed a protection charm from around her neck
and put it around her husband's neck.
That man ran towards the city wall, and started to try and scale it. The city wall was smooth, built to make climbing difficult, and after grabbing at it a few times, he still couldn't climb up. The rest of the men called out, "Let me help you." And they pushed him up. A crowd of
10-something men stacked themselves into a human pyramid, and helped deliver him higher upon the wall.
There, that man managed to grab onto the rope that had been used to lower water and food, and he continued to climb. At the bottom, hundreds of thousands watched anxiously, not daring to cheer for him, scared they might be discovered. The soldiers on top of the towers had been standing watch for many days, and the Yong'an refugees hadn't started anything, so they were fairly lax in their watch. It wasn't until that man had reached halfway did they notice with a start someone pressing close onto the wall.
They shouted, "What are you doing?" Exclamation mark. "No climbing. Climbers will be killed without
mercy. Do you hear me? Climbers will be killed without mercy." Under their threat, that man also shouted back, "I don't have any ill intentions. I just want to
bring my child to the doctors. I won't do anything else."
He continued scaling the wall as he shouted. One of the superior officers was just having his meal, and upon hearing of this he became outraged. If that man was to scale the wall safely and set an example, wouldn't many more Yong'an refugees attempt the same? He must be stopped. Thus, he strode out, and shouted down the parapet, "Don't you value your life?
Go back down.
This instant. If you don't, you'll be sorry."
Yet that man had already reached high on the wall, past halfway, and with just one more push he'd be able
to reach the top, so naturally he didn't stop. That superior officer never had anyone disobey him like this. His words were law. Whoever disobeyed was easy enough to take care of, however.
He approached the
parapet, pulled his sword, and struck. That rope snapped in two. With the snapped rope in hand, that man fell from midair. In the midst of thousands screaming, he landed heavily on the hard ground before the city gates.
That was the moment Xianle arrived.
That man had fallen with his backside down, and on his back was his child. Whump, and the child was crushed into a clump of ground meat, spraying blossoms of blood. That man's neck was broken, his eyes bulging, and around his twisted neck rolled a protection charm with the words Xianle written on it.
Embroidered with golden threads, it was the protection charm from the temple of the Crown Prince.
The moment before he started to climb, that man and his wife both held that protection charm in their hands and silently prayed for the blessings of His Highness the Crown Prince, which was how Xianle heard their voices and rushed over. Nevertheless, he was not a hero from any of those legends written in books, and could in no way appear
right before the executioner dropped their axes, and save lives from under knives.
That woman didn't even have the courage to flip her husband's dead body to check on the condition of her son. She covered her face and screamed, and without looking, she dashed forward madly, and bashed her head against the wall. Crack, and she dropped, her body limp. Right before Xianle's eyes, in the flash of a second, 3 dead bodies piled before the city gates of the royal capital. He hadn't had time to react before the crowd outside the city gates were riled up, unable to hold back any longer. Someone yelled, "Dead!" A family of 3, all dead. Look, that's the good old officer working for His Majesty.
He won't save us, but instead is forcing our deaths.
You won't let us in, but you won't let anyone out either. What should we have done? 3 bloody lives are now on your hands. You said to expel all Yong'an refugees from the royal capital, but how come I don't see any of the rich ones expelled? So the poor and powerless deserve to die. I've
seen through you. I can't stand it anymore, I really can't.
Year after year we paid our taxes, but now
there's a disaster. Where did all that money go?
Rather than aiding disaster victims, did all the money go to parasites and building your son's temples? Just this bit of food and rations to shut us up. What do you take us for? Useless king. Incompetent king. The soldiers on top of the towers were yelling down at the crowd for them to stop, but that officer had seen much in his lifetime, and didn't take any of it seriously. Yet the situation was slowly getting out of
control.
Thousands and hundreds of thousands pushed furiously against the gates, some even using their own heads or bodies to slam, and this time, it wasn't mere ants on trees.
The gates moved. In fact, even the entire fortress wall and towers were slightly shaking. Ever since Xianle was born, he had never witnessed a situation such as this.
The people he met had all been kind, peaceful, happy, satisfied, and endearing.
Those twisted faces, crying and screaming, forced
him to enter a completely foreign world, and he couldn't help but feel cold in his bones. Even against the
most horrifying ghosts and demons, he had never felt this way.
Just then, there was an angry roar from above. He whipped his head around, and saw a tall and gaunt silhouette, choking that officer who had cut the rope and caused the 3 deaths below the city walls. There was a loud and clear crack, and his neck was broken.
That band of soldiers had no idea how that man suddenly appeared. All were shocked and bewildered, and they rushed forward with their swords in hand to surround him. "Who?
Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark.
How did you get up here?"
Exclamation mark. Xianle immediately noticed that man's hands, they were smeared with blood and ripped flesh. That man had scaled that crevice-less wall using his bare hands. When that figure turned around, it was indeed Lang Ying. Lang Ying was calm and collected even when surrounded by soldiers. He crossed over the parapet, threw the corpse of that officer down, and he himself jumped off, stepping onto the corpse and using it as a stepping stone to break his fall. That moment when he jumped, he looked straight at Xianle, but what he was looking at wasn't Xianle. Instead, he looked through him to gaze at the royal palace sitting right in the center of the royal capital. From that day onwards, the entire kingdom of Xianle was thrown into chaos. Next chapter. Ch.77, Xianle in chaos, Crown Prince returns to the mortal realm. For displaced disaster victims like those from Yong'an, to fight against the imperial army was a losing battle, a gross overestimation of their own strength. Yet those who were cornered often possessed the courage to court one's ruin and bite off more than they
could chew.
After that one riot, the hundreds of thousands of Yong'an refugees finally left the city gates,
backing off to some distance away, and changed where they built temporary camps.
However, they just wouldn't leave. They might die on the road if they keep going, and hanging around was
also death. So what was the difference?
Using the rations and water the king distributed from before, plus munching on bark skins, wild herbs, plant roots, critters and insects, and with a build-up of resentment and loathing on top of all that, those people possessed an unimaginably persistent will to live, and stubbornly persevered. After a few days, they managed to assemble some thousands of men, all carrying hoes, rakes, rocks, branches, and returned for a bout of fighting. Although this clash was a mess, an utter defeat with over half of that thousand-some dead, it wasn't fruitless. Lang Ying invaded the castle tower and returned hauling a few large bags of grain and weapons. There may have been serious casualties, but it provoked a will to fight to the death amongst the people.
Their nature was akin to that of bandits.
They attacked once, twice, thrice. The soldiers of Xianle soon discovered that those bandits were rapidly improving. The initially inexperienced rioters had gradually gotten the hang of things, and every time they attacked, they were more difficult to deal with than the last. Those who could return to camp alive increased with every attempt. There were also endless waves of new refugees joining, significantly growing the size of the group. How to best deal with those bandits became the hottest topic for debate within the kingdom of Xianle, and after 5 to 6 such ridiculous guerrilla attacks, Xianle could no longer sit still on the
parapet and simply watch. He hadn't reported to the heavens in a long time, but this time when he arrived at the heavenly court, he dashed straight for the great martial hall without a word. When he broke in, Jun Wu was seated in his
throne, and a number of heavenly officials were bowing to receive a command, seeming to be discussing An important matter. In the past, Xianle would have chosen a different day to pay his visit, but now, he couldn't wait, and went in bluntly, opening his mouth to speak without pause. My lord, I'm returning to the mortal realm. The heavenly officials were all startled, and immediately covered their mouths, keeping silent, not
wanting to show any kind of reaction.
John Wu looked at him knowingly for a moment, then rose from his
throne, speaking in a gentle tone.
Xianle,
I know something of what's happening, but you must remain calm. My lord, I didn't come here to request permission.
I came here to inform, Xianle said. My people are currently sunken in the depths of hell, so please forgive me if I cannot remain calm.
The universe has its own rhythm, John Wu said.
Do you not realize that if you descend to appear before
mortals, it will be a violation of heavenly law?
If it's a violation, then so be it. Xianle cried. Hearing this, all the faces of the officials present dropped. There had never been any heavenly officials who dared to speak such words with such gusto and confidence, no matter how highly John Wu regarded this young, early ascended prince of Xianle. It was still an act of daring arrogance.
Soon after, Xianle bent to bow. Pray my lord, let me go this once. Just give me a little time. Since the fighting has started, casualties are unavoidable, but if I could stop this and reduce the number of dead, minimize the conflict, then after the fighting ends I will for sure return willingly to repent, and have my lord sentence me as see fit. Whether I shall be sealed under a mountain for 100 years, 1,000 years, 100,000 years, I will not regret. After having had his say, he remained in the bowing posture and stood down, leaving the great hall. Xianle,
John Wu called. Xianle's feet paused in his step.
John Wu watched him, then sighed.
You can't save everyone. Xianle slowly straightened up. Whether I can, I won't know until I've tried. Even if the heavens say I must die, if that sword doesn't pierce my heart and nail me dead on the ground, then I am still alive, and till my last breath I will struggle to the end. Returning to the mortal realm for the first time in solid form was unlike all the previous times he
descended. Xianle felt like something had been thrown away.
He was both somewhat light and at the same time, somewhat heavy. His first action was to return to the palace immediately. The king and the queen were in the chamber behind the royal bureau, whispering between themselves,
their expressions solemn and exhausted.
Xianle came to the door and was anxious at first, but then he calmed his nerves, raised the beaded curtain, and walked in. Father.
The king and the queen both looked back at the same time and were stunned.
A moment later, it was the queen who stood up first, crying joyously. My son.
She extended both her hands and came forward to welcome him.
Xianle caught her arms, accepting the gesture. But before the smiles went away, he suddenly saw the king's growing dark expression.
The king demanded, Why have you descended?
Xianle's smile froze. Before, when he heard his parents talk behind his back, Xianle had felt maybe his father did still miss
him, and wasn't as opinionated against him as he made it seem.
He had thought that the king would at least show some degree of pleasure in seeing his return, and if that was the case, then surely he would
return the affection.
But who knew the king would react this way, so full of scorn, and so Lian's own temper flared up.
He replied sharply, "Why have I descended?
Isn't it all because of you?"
Exclamation mark.
That the situation with Yong'an had come to this, shouldn't you ask yourselves whether you're responsible? The king's expression completely changed, and he countered harshly, "My responsibility? Is that something you can say to me?" Exclamation mark. His fury had made him forget to refer to his own title, and the queen teared up. The situation has already come to this, so why are you two still arguing? We're not arguing, Lian said.
We're talking about sense.
Even if you are the king, my father, if you are the one responsible, why can I not say anything? Why didn't you work harder to fundraise? If the funds were all swallowed by government checkpoints, why didn't you punish the corrupt officials? If you were tough like thunder and fast like lightning, catch one, jail one, then would there still be so many corrupt parasites who dare steal? Wouldn't the situation be better than it is now?
Veins popped on the king's forehead, and he banged on his bureau desk.
Quiet. Do you take the royal treasury for a bottomless well that can fix any hole that leaks? Exclamation mark. Catch one, jail one, if it was that easy, if by just one order from this king and it'd work fast like lightning, tough as thunder, then why has history never had a dynasty untouched by corruption? What do you understand?
You ignorant child.
Dare speak politics with me? Fine, Lian acquiesced.
I don't understand.
Then even if the royal capital had no room for the victims to settle and expulsion was inevitable, why not provide more expenses for them? Why not provide more comfort and security and have an army escort their journey eastward?
The king's eyes bulged with rage, and he pointed to the sky. Scram! Get out of here!
Get back to the heavens. Just looking at you annoys me. Don't ever appear again. Lian had descended with a heart full of fervor, yet the first encounter with his parents was his father yelling for him to scram back to the heavens. Without a word, Lian bowed to him, and stood down to leave. The queen chased after him out of the bureau and pulled him to a stop. My son. Lian said gently, Mother, don't worry.
I'm just going to go make a round around the royal capital and
check on the situation.
The queen shook her head.
My son, I don't understand those political matters, but I understand your father. Throughout the years, I've seen how he is as a king.
You can think from the bottom of your heart
that he isn't competent, and sometimes I think so too, I just don't say it out loud. But you can't say that to his face. He's your father, after all. If you tell him straight on that he's no good, it really kills the heart.
Lian opened and closed his mouth. The queen added, You might have been the crown prince, but you have never been king.
Politics isn't like cultivation. When you first entered the royal holy pavilion, the guoshi had said cultivation only concerns the heart, isn't that right? Lian nodded slowly, and the queen clutched his hands. But there are many other things in this world that by just having heart isn't enough. You must be capable too, and not just you, but your subordinates must be capable as well, and not just ability, they must
share the same heart as you.
Xianle remained silent.
After a moment, he asked, "Is the royal treasury suffering?"
"I don't need temples."
"Tell him to stop building so many temples for me. Those golden statues can go."
The queen replied miserably, "My child, of course there's some of your father's partialness in building temples. He wanted to give you the best, and have you look impressive in the heavens. But, do you know
just how many of those 8,000 temples were actually built by your father?"
You don't know, do you? Xianle really didn't know, and he gave it a thought. Half. If your father really used funds from the royal treasury to build 4,000 temples, we needn't wait
for the Yong'an refugees to start anything. The royal capital would revolt first, the queen said.
So if the royal treasury is empty, where did all that money come from? Your father built maybe 20-some temples, and others followed suit, masses of them wanting to build too, to get on his good side, to get on
your good side. So is that counted on your father's head too?
Xianle was stumped. The queen said softly, "Your father isn't the greatest king, but he's done his best.
Only, in this world, just
doing your best isn't good enough." After a pause, she added, "Right now, you feel sympathy for those Yong'an refugees, so you blame your father. But they're all his people. Do you think we're the ones bullying them? In truth."
Halfway through her words, the enraged voice of the king rang from within the bureau.
"What are you doing saying so many useless things to him? Make him leave and go back to the heavens." The queen turned her head back and sighed. "My son, don't descend for this. Go back." After leaving the palace, Xianle wandered down an alleyway near the martial deity avenue, and as he walked, Fengxin and Mu King appeared in a hurry. The moment Mu King approached, he questioned in disbelief, "Your Highness,
you requested to descend
into the mortal realm. You went and spoke to the heavenly emperor?"
"Yes," Xianle answered.
"Why didn't you tell me first?" Mu King demanded. Fengxin was puzzled.
"What do you mean?
Does His Highness have to report to anyone what he wants to do?"
However, Mu King appeared to be losing it. "Why not?
We're his subordinates, and right now we're all
tied together.
His every action affects us, so is there something wrong in me wanting to know what he plans on doing? We'd have to follow His Highness no matter what he does anyway. Heaven or earth, he has his plans. What are you afraid of?"
Fengxin said.
"You,"
Mu King shouted. "I'm not afraid.
"I'm only." Xianle raised his hand.
Enough. Stop arguing."
Fengxin and Mu King quieted immediately. Just then, a long line of demonstrating crowds paraded down the main street, and thousands of citizens were hollering,
"There will be no peace in the kingdom until Yong'an is exterminated.
They've gone too far in creating disorder. They're cancerous." The people of Xianle had never been so aggressive towards anything, and with such a roaring protest
demonstration, too. Xianle couldn't help but think something was amiss.
Fengxin, on the other hand, frowned. How come there's a woman in there? Sure enough, in that parading crowd, a young woman was leading at the forefront. That young woman was slender, her skin snow white, her eyes bright and black, her cheeks flushed not from shyness but from rage, a catching sight. By then Mu King had calmed himself down and said coldly, "His Highness doesn't recognize her." "No," Lian replied.
Feng Xin knitted his brows.
"Looks familiar." "She's one of the catalysts," Mu King said. "What catalyst?" Lian asked. "The catalyst for the standoff," Mu King replied. Because there were more and more Yong'an refugees in the royal capital, and some would go around causing issues, not quietly minding their own business. The parliament was discussing the matter of expulsion, and word of it was spreading. There was a Yong'an refugee who wanted to stay and not be expelled, so he decided to take a risk.
One night, he
snuck into the house of a wealthy family, and kidnapped the daughter. Hearing this, Lian couldn't wrap his head around it. Why would he kidnap a rich family's daughter if
he didn't want to leave?
Mu King gave him a look. To marry her. It's just that, if it wasn't through forcible means, no daughter of a good standing family in the royal capital would marry a person of Yong'an.
He didn't say it plainly, but Lian understood.
He had never thought that it was something that could be done, that there were actually people in this world like that. That something like this actually happened. A sudden desire to vomit rolled up from his chest.
Feng Xin angrily cursed on the spot. Despicable.
Just then, a group of aunties rushed over, grabbing and pulling at that young woman. By the looks of it, she had come out when her family wasn't paying attention. That young woman wouldn't yield, yelling, "I'm not afraid. I've nothing to be embarrassed about, I wasn't
in the wrong."
Feng Xin was amazed. "That chick's pretty spunky." "Yes," Mu King said.
"Because she didn't come from a commoner background.
Her father is a high-ranking official, and her mother came from a family of wealthy merchants in the royal capital. They
refused to suffer this shame quietly, and definitely wouldn't marry off their daughter like that for the sake of shame, so they beat that Yong'an man to death."
Soon after, all the wealthy merchants and gentlemen of renown in the capital signed a petition, listing all the crimes the Yong'an refugees had committed since entering the capital, and bade the king to jail all of them to be punished severely. There's no need to speak on where the government officials all stand on this. After a pause, he said with a casual air, "I hear that the girl's father had once wanted her to enter the harem and fight for the position of the prince's consort. Your Highness must have seen her face a few times. A long time ago, yet you don't recognize her." Lian finally realized that everything was much more complicated than he had imagined. Two sides of a tumultuous standoff had long been formed within and outside the city. All the peoples were enraged, wishing to kill off the other. If the king's decree was partial to Yong'an, wouldn't that be slapping his own people's faces? When at last the decision was made to distribute some travel expenses to the Yong'an refugees from the royal treasury, there were probably also a large number of residents who were
displeased. What was even more frightening than a displeased enemy was the dissatisfaction of a kingdom's own people. Although technically everyone was of Xianle, right now, there were probably very few who'd think so. Lian had been standing from high up and had long not known the matters of the mortal realm, but his
father was still in the mortal realm. As a king, he needed money, he needed people, and in his position, the stress, the pressure, the compromise he needed to make between people and issues were not comparable. to any of the troubles Xianle knew. When the Yong'an refugees arrived, they took over land, created
noise, stole and robbed, and so on. To a martial god sitting in a temple, these were all small matters. However, to the residents of the royal capital, they were all very real, unchassable, intolerable tortures, a crisis waiting to erupt. To think this a simple, trivial matter, it was only because he wasn't the one situated within. Xianle couldn't help but recall that the king's moustache tails were even whiter than the last time he had seen him. Last time, the king said he was going to diet, but he probably didn't have the energy to care anymore. When Xianle was younger, he firmly believed his father was the world's greatest king. But the older he got, the more he realized that wasn't the case. His father, although king, couldn't be said to be wise and competent, and was even a little corrupt, making mistakes often. Taking away his prestigious status, he was no more than a common man. The more he realized this, the more disappointed he became, and the king had also noticed his disappointment. And all the more the king couldn't accept every disagreeing look, every disagreeing word from Xianle. What he couldn't accept the most, however, was having Xianle see his failure. No father in the world wished to have their sons see their failures. Every father wished that before their sons, they would always be the greatest. Yet Xianle appeared before him at such a time to berate his own father. "You're making a mess of things. So much so that I had to descend to help you out." As both a king and a father, how could he have withstood hearing that that young woman was finally taken away by her servant ladies, and the remaining hundreds of demonstrating residents continued their protest, waving signs and hollering. They were only crying for one thing: kill them. Start the battle. Show those Yong'an refugees outside the city walls. A moment later, new king spoke up. "Your Highness, it's best if you go back and apologize to the Heavenly Emperor." At this point, fortune, time, and place are all lost. There is no helping. Just as Junwu had told him at the Great Martial Hall, the universe has its own rhythm. It was like telling him, "The kingdom of Xianle's time has come, let it go." Even the queen, his mother, who wished day and night only to have a glimpse of him, when she finally saw him, asked him to leave with tears in her eyes. How could Xianle not know that they simply didn't want him to go through this difficult trial, and would rather he watch from afar, taking a good care of himself instead? But how could he possibly? Xianle said gravely, "No." And he strode out.